So, when we left off last time, we were talking about the Ottoman Empire and the role of the Sultan and the Janissaries and the Turkish nobles in that empire. Namely that the Janissaries, who were a group of ruling slaves, were orientated to the Sultan's threat narrative, so that they would essentially serve the Sultan despite having the majority of the power in the empire. Now, someone pointed out as a potential counter-argument that the Janissaries had so much power in the Ottoman Empire that they could elect and dispose of sultans. And the reality is that, yeah, that's true. But it's not a counter-argument to the idea that the Sultan represented the Janissaries' identity. What you have to understand about this situation is the key to it is the economy of vulnerability. The more vulnerable the Sultan is to the Janissaries, the more he controls their identity through that vulnerability. It's his vulnerability that gives him his power. But on the other hand, at the same time this vulnerability gives him greater control over their identity, his vulnerability also, makes him vulnerable to them. Gives them power over him. You can look at that and you can say, wow, that's a really sort of crazy system. I mean, if the Sultan is fully aware of this catch-22, he certainly loves to live dangerously. But that's the thing. The Sultan wasn't aware, because he himself was a pawn in someone else's threat narrative. Threat narratives manipulate, destroy, and enslave. But that last one, enslave, is a bit more tricky than the others. In order to set up a system of slavery that lasts any length of time, the oppressor has to ensure that their oppression, that they're enacting, wears the oppressed's face. To understand why, you have to know what a threat narrative is a distortion of. Boundaries. Boundaries are sort of like a cell membrane. They decide what's within and without. If boundaries are like a cell membrane, then a threat narrative is like a virus. It takes over a cell and turns that cell into something useful to itself. But first it must turn off the cell's immune response, so the cell doesn't recognize the foreign invader for what it is. And once the virus has successfully breached the cell membrane, has successfully turned off the cell's sense of vulnerability, the virus can target the center of the cell's identity and establish itself as the controller over what belongs within the cell and what should be outside the cell. Once it has taken over the cell's identity, it can turn the cell to doing whatever it wants. When the master controls the threat narrative, she can assign herself a permanent within status and establish herself as judge and jury over who belongs. She does this by stripping the slaves of their own identities through shame. It's not her invading them, it's them invading her. For a slave population, recognizing their vulnerability to the master is the first step to re-establishing their boundaries with the master on the outside and themselves defining the inside. The main way a slave comes to identify with their vulnerabilities is when the master takes on the role of direct oppressor. This must be avoided at all costs to ensure a system of slavery survives. And to ensure this, 1. The slaves must identify with the master's threat narrative, thus be defined by her vulnerabilities. 2. The slaves must always see the master as more vulnerable to them as slaves than they as slaves are to the master. 3. Direct oppression of slaves must be done by the slaves themselves, which both prevents the association of oppression with the master and fractures the group identity of the slaves even further. Vulnerability is key in this system. The master must always be seen as more vulnerable to the slaves than vice versa, in part because her vulnerability serves to define them, and also because should the slaves become aware of their vulnerability to her, they might begin to assert boundaries and develop their own threat narratives against the master. Finally, the master's vulnerability serves as a smokescreen, hiding the true nature of the master-slave exchange. Now, in order for a system of slavery to last longer and to be even more profound than that of the Janissaries and the Ottoman Empire, the processes I've outlined have to be even more seamless. The master's agency has to be even more occult, the master's vulnerability to the slaves even more prominent, and the process of branding slaves with shame excused as just a natural, unavoidable process, if it's even perceived at all. A system of slavery will last only as long as the master is perceived to be more vulnerable than the slaves. Let me repeat that. A system of slavery will only last as long as the master is perceived to be more vulnerable than the slaves. Slaves asserting their vulnerability is thus the first and most difficult step to ending slavery. Most slaves will prefer to hide in the comfortable fiction of invulnerability. The master will spare no expense to shame and humiliate those slaves who take this step, even going so far as to engage in acts of direct oppression, direct violence. This is their inevitable undoing.